Hello class, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about entering and contracting. I think this is particularly important as this is the current stage that you are in your group consulting projects for this class. So over the next 15 minutes, I want to talk about the steps associated with starting a plan change process, which is really what you're doing right now. And I want to reinforce to you the idea that an OD practitioner is anyone who is helping a system to make a planned change. That can be someone in informal or formal roles, someone who is an OD practitioner in title, or someone who is just in a managerial role or in some other sort of informal, influential role within an organization, that we all can contribute to meaningful plan change within an organization. So first, the consulting process. Now, we've talked a bit about this in previous videos. This diagram's a little bit different than the previous ones, but the elements are essentially the same. Right now, you're at the contracting stage. The entry stage is where you're actually soliciting business. Now, I did that part for you. I brought in a client project, had that ready-made for you, and so you didn't have to go out and try to find your own project. There are some classes where in this program where you will have to go out and find your own project, and that can be difficult, but that's the life of a consultant. So when whether you're an internal or an external consultant, usually there's an expectation that you have, as part of your job, that you have to go out and drum up business. You have to go out and find people who need help and bring them in for consulting work. So that's the entry stage. The contracting stage is where you're at right now. That's where you're trying to formalize your proposal to say exactly what you're going to do. That's where you do your initial needs analysis to understand what they need, what help they're looking for, the gaps that you can help fill, and then formalize that in a document. So we'll be talking a little bit more about the contracting element, and the template proposal that you're going to be filling out for this class, but we'll talk about generally principles that should be included in any sort of contracting document when you have opportunities in the future. After the contracting stage is done, then you move into data gathering. This is where you can collect data by doing a survey, by doing interviews, focus groups, looking at existing materials and documents from the organization, secondary data that might be available. There's lots of different approaches, and we're going to be talking about each of these other stages in the consulting process over the coming weeks, including data gathering. Once you gather the data, then you start to diagnose. You start to try to figure out, what does the data actually tell us? How does it help us understand the problem? And then you move into feedback. That's where you have the opportunity to loop back with the client, where you can explain to them what you're seeing from the data you've collected, share with them what you're finding, get their input, their feedback, and together you can plan the intervention, the particulars of the intervention that you're going to try and conduct. Once the intervention is implemented, at that point you need to do some sort of an evaluation. You want to make sure that your intervention is meaningful and sustainable, and that it actually accomplishes what you plan for it to accomplish. So you have to have an assessment and evaluation plan in place, and ultimately you have to have an exit strategy, because most consulting engagements do come to an end. Now, there are examples where consultants will end up working for a client for years, even in long-term ongoing projects, but that's more rare, and most of the time you're looking at a smaller time frame, like a semester-bound course in your example, but maybe a few months, maybe half a year, maybe even a year. I've had projects that have gone anywhere from a couple weeks to a couple months, up to the longest I ever had with one organization on a continuous project was about a year and a half. So anyways, you need to have a plan in place for how you're going to exit, how you're going to hand off the baton, how you're going to make sure that they can take the reins of the project and the implementation, that they can sustain the change that you've helped start, so that things can continue to have success. In the entering process, you clarify the organizational issues, the presenting problems, the symptoms. You determine the relevant client, understanding the key stakeholders and the key players within the organization. Sometimes within a given organization, you'll have multiple clients. You'll have multiple contracts to work on different problems, addressing different symptoms. You also have to be thinking about the particular consultant, whether that's you, or someone else on your team. The client is going to be thinking about which consultant they want to work with. And ultimately, you're trying to demonstrate your expertise and your experience to be able to solve the presenting problem. But coming back up to the very top, clarifying the organizational issues and the presenting problem, I think here it's really important that we ask lots of questions, because sometimes the symptoms and the presenting problems aren't necessarily the ones that are at the root of the issue. Sometimes they're surface level things that are easy to notice. And then if that's all you address, you end up putting a Band-Aid over a problem rather than trying to address core issues. So ask lots of questions, try to understand really where they're coming from. Also, here you can see a bunch of different types of clients. I'm not going to read through all of this slide, but you can take a look at this. Ultimately, you need to understand the type of client that you're working with, because different types of clients have different types of needs. And your goal is to get in, get started, learn about the client, understand their needs, and then start to help them. And that can only happen if and when you have a decent understanding from the get-go of the type of person or the type of team or the type of organization that you're working with. Okay, now let's get into contracting. Again, this is the stage that you're at right now in your project. This is the process of coming to an agreement on what you will do in the OD project. It can be written or verbal. However, in this day and age of contracts and litigation and all those sorts of things, I would highly recommend that you always have a written form of the agreement, even if initially it is verbal. You need to understand the client's perception of the situation or problem, make sure that you have a win-win with mutual wants and expectations, define what success will look like and how you plan to measure it, and understand that your OD project shouldn't be just a one-time event. We talked last week about how every touch point, every connection with the client is part of your overall intervention strategy. So even that initial needs assessment, that initial client meeting that you have with them, that's part of the whole intervention process. Data collection, meeting with people, talking with people, actually conducting trainings, going in and doing surveys, any sort of actual implementation of an activity or different types of events. These are all part of an overarching process and an overarching intervention strategy. So you want to keep that in mind and have that present in the agreement that you come to with your client. Some of the types of questions that it's good to try to answer early on in the contracting stage. What does the client really want? What do you need from the client in order to accomplish your project? What will you do and deliver for them? What will your role be? What will the client's role be? What's the time schedule? What about confidentiality? What concerns do they have about that? How and when will you give them feedback on what you're finding from various data sources? This is just a start. I mean, so these are good questions to start with, and I know all of you have already met with your client and you've asked these types of questions, but you may find as you continue on in the project and as you continue to work on your proposal for the project that you need to ask clarifying questions and follow-up questions. Please ask lots of questions. At this stage, that's just really important to truly understand. So, something that you'll have an opportunity to discuss in the discussion board this week. The last slide had a list of questions to be answered in the contracting stage. Can you think of other good questions? I know that your teams, many of the teams, spent time preparing questions to go and talk to the client prior to your first client meeting. What types of questions did you ask? What other types of questions maybe have you thought of since that initial client meeting? These are the types of things we really want to think about carefully as we move forward. Now, I provide you with a proposal template for this class, and that's your first big deliverable related to this project, is to create your proposal and to be able to submit that to me and to your client for approval, and then you're off to the races for the rest of the semester doing all of your project elements and deliverables and such. But recognize that the template that I give you isn't like a universal document. There's no like magic silver bullet to like what it should look like or anything like that. So I don't want to give that impression, but I find it useful just to give you something to start with at this stage as you're learning the process. But once you are out on your own, or you're working within an organization as an internal consultant or doing outside consulting work, you want to have some sort of document where you outline the different elements of the project and what your proposal is. So here you can see some of those common elements, goals of the actual effort, your recommended plan of action, specification of responsibilities for the different team members, strategy for achieving the desired state, and then always fees, terms, and conditions, anything that needs to be outlined so that the client understands the particulars of what's expected for them. And something I didn't mention on a previous slide, I've mentioned it in previous videos in the class, is that a big part of being a consultant is managing expectations. And you do a lot of that in this proposal stage, in the contracting stage. You need to underpromise, overdeliver. And you can't underpromise to the extent where they don't want you to come work for them because you're underselling yourself. That's not what I mean. But you don't want to overpromise and underdeliver, because then they're not happy. But if you can have a reasonable expectation and manage those expectations and then deliver above and beyond those expectations, then that's when people are thrilled with you and what you accomplish for them. So that's what you're shooting for in the contracting stage. Some additional elements. Like I just mentioned, mutual expectations are clear. What are the outcomes and deliverables? What do the results look like, and how are you going to share those and publish those? Involvement of various stakeholders in the whole process. What type of time and resources do you need? General ground rules for non-disclosure, confidentiality. All those sorts of elements are things that you need to think carefully about and talk about with the client. In that initial contracting meeting, that initial client meeting, you're going to ask a lot of questions. Here are some additional things to think about. Ask, listen, paraphrase, feedback. So you ask questions, they talk back to you and tell you what they're thinking. So you rephrase that. It sounds like you're having difficulty with coordination between the marketing and sales departments. And then you have an opportunity to provide clarification. And they can say whether or not you heard them correctly. So clarify the problem. What do you mean by X? How often does X happen? Give support. I appreciate your willingness to talk to me about this difficult problem. Communicate understanding of the problem. It's common for groups to feel competitive in this manner, but the time pressure placed on both groups makes this situation unique. Be explicit. I want to be clear. I don't think we will solve this problem with one workshop. Again, that comes back to managing expectations as well. Be explicit, be clear, manage expectations, ultimately end with feedback. So another discussion opportunity in the discussion board this week. In that initial client meeting during the entry stage and that contracting stage, clients often want reassurance that the practitioner can address the problem, but the practitioner must try not to overpromise results. What are some ways that the practitioner can walk this line in that first meeting? As I mentioned a few minutes ago, you have to sell yourself. You have to sell your capabilities and what you can do for them, but you don't want to overpromise things that you can't deliver. So how do you manage reasonable expectations and then give yourself the opportunity to overdeliver on what their expectations are so they're thrilled with you? That's something to think carefully about as you move forward throughout this experience this semester. Another question. Imagine you were meeting with a client in the Northern County case study that you did a couple weeks ago. What questions would you want to ask during the contracting meeting? What were some key things that would help clarify the situation for you that would allow you to be effective as a consultant and coming in as an OD practitioner? Finally, you don't want to get stuck in the contracting stage. So sometimes you just need to be explicit and open with the client, saying, you know what, we don't seem to be moving anywhere. We need to come to agreement. Sometimes you need to take a break. get fresh eyes on it. But ultimately, you want to move on from contracting pretty quickly so you can get going.